Hello, divas and dudes. Welcome to Powerhouse Bakery. Thank you so much for joining me and being a part of our study. And I know sometimes this whole topic of GMOs and bioengineering, I hope is not boring or dry. I want to really make sure it's relevant and interesting to you, and also will allow you to have more areas of study and pursuing just kind of what all this means to us as far as health enthusiasts. And what I want to kind of cover today is what the labels help to tell us, how we vary from Europe or other countries, kind of how our regulations measure up to other countries in the world, and then really have a chance to shed light on what are the potential risks with genetic engineering. I know we've talked about this quite a bit, so I want to make sure that I answer questions and help you kind of see where are we going with all of this, and is it truly something that we should be fearful of or concerned about, or is it something that with better understanding we can appreciate the value and know that it's going in a healthy direction. What I've tried to present to you so far is a little bit of guidance around what regulatory bodies are involved. So we know that the FDA, the USDA, we even have some watchdog groups that try to really help shed light on food safety, and the Center for Science and the Public Interest. I talked about another organization called the Cornucopia, and that's a really important way to be able to have information for the consumer as far as what products have risk, and how do we look for them. And so these lists help us just to gain more information. So today what I wanted to do was have some different labels that we could look at, but I couldn't really find hardly any other than the real simple one that we've looked at. And so as I go through our little slides here, this bioengineered slide, this one that shows kind of a picture of maybe a visual presentation of maybe a field and the sun, and it's trying to look beautiful, is really helping to change the view of what GMO is all about. So they're changing the term from GMO to bioengineered. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that we're trying to step away from some of the fear around the GMO term, and it's been in the news for a long time, right? I mean, we've heard about it. We've been kind of warned that this gloom and doom is coming, that it's going to damage our foods, and it's going to be bad for our health. And so this kind of scare tactics have shed a negative light on this term GMO, genetically modified organism. And so now that they have this new label, I thought, well, I'll just get some products and we can look at it. And as I mentioned last time, a lot of what's actually engineered is not going to be found in our produce area. We don't see a GMO tomato. Anybody remember when they had a flavor, a special flavor, I forget the term, a flavor saver, I think it is, of a tomato that was made in the 80s? And it was a genetically modified tomato that would take longer to ripen, so it had a longer travel time, and it had this label on it in the produce, and people refused to buy it. It was, again, fear of the unknown, and so it became very unpopular. So now when we try to go find these labels, it's a little tough. As of January 2022, it's required for companies to do this labeling. But what's interesting is there's plenty of loopholes that make it hard to find the labels. And so that's what I want to kind of go over today and help you kind of see where the industry is. I've talked a lot too about all the filtering. So the grocery store companies and who kind of chooses what goes into different stores like H-E-B, the powers that be kind of make the decision of what customer do they want, and so what are they going to allow in their stores. There's another entity that says, well, this organics category that is a multi-billion-dollar industry, huge factor in evolving our foods. They have a big say in whether or not foods can be genetically modified and still carry the organic label. So that's another big journey that is kind of going on. But I think what we're going to find out is that science is still going to be behind the research that pushes our understanding and our safety net. Now, while Europe does have a little stricter criteria, they still follow the scientific approach, which is let's try to figure out what the risks are, and let's figure out how we want to keep our public healthy. So, I think ultimately we want to have confidence in that system. So if we look at this little slide, it talks about the genetically modified organism and what is it as defined. So it says that a living organism whose genetic material has been artificially manipulated in a lab through genetic engineering, creating combinations of plant and animal, bacteria and virus genes that do not occur in nature or through traditional crossbreeding methods, products of new genetic engineering techniques, including CRISPR, which is that really cool technique that was developed by a woman that has been really just a whole new generation of thinking. But what we want to understand is, how do these genes that are creating a newer, stronger organism affect us and our health? There was even some research that was talked about not long ago, and it showed how rats were really getting a cancer because of some glyphosate products. And on further review, when we looked at that research, it was actually debunked because of the scientific setup. That the sample size wasn't big enough. It turned out they picked rats that were already predisposed to cancer. There was all these things. And so I think what's important for us to do is to really hold true to the scientific approach and understand that, are these genetically modified organisms something that is really dangerous, or is it something that we can just use as we go further in understanding how to better feed the human population. I thought this little slide was interesting too. This is from a great organization, and it's called the SciShow. If you ever can hop on this on YouTube, great information. And I love YouTube because you've got a wealth of experts, and they give you resources, they give you information to look further into a subject. And so take note of this little group, because I think it's worth following. This SCI show. Now, what this slide is showing is just to understand that the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, the bacteria kingdoms are distinct. And so understanding that the crossbreeding of DNA wouldn't happen in nature, but within each category, things are going to evolve in a way that is going to make the entity, better, stronger, faster, more resilient. And so I think it's important to kind of see the tree of life, the plants and bacteria aren't even in the same branch. So what potential risk does that give us? And, that's kind of the crux of the issue. But that doesn't mean that science can't utilize these ideas in a healthy way. So there's the two sides of the coin. It doesn't happen in nature, so if man does it, does that mean it's unhealthy, or is it something that we can still value? And kind of what happens in this whole genetic modification is changing one small gene rather than a group of genes. So the idea is that it's not as dangerous if it's just one little piece. So we'll see. In this slide, what I wanted to just depict is, and Irene, if you can see this either, really what this is depicting is a couple of different ways the genetic modification happens. And it's really quite amazing. I mean, they use a mineral, they use actually gold in a couple of these ideas, and they're basically shooting this DNA kind of random into the seeds, trying to hope that some of it will implant, but it takes generations of change and evolution for it to really take. So when you think of that little tomato that had evolved, or even the Monsanto soybean, it took years to go from the scientific initiation of this idea to it coming to fruition. And think about it. I mean, no wonder it's big business, because organics are big business. And so now how do we really get this whole crop idea to benefit the farmer that isn't huge agribusiness? And it's making it more and more difficult when we have this years and years of research that are required in order to make sure the crops can survive out in the wild. So it's really an interesting conundrum. This slide is another one where it's showing the agrobacterium. So this little picture is really just showing how one method of getting the new DNA strand into the cell or into the plant is by using bacteria. And we of course use this idea when we're learning about antibiotics. And so there's science here that has been part of our culture for many years. And so a lot of this is not new, but it's been presented to us in the food world that kind of makes it seem foreign and scary. And I think another big part of it is it makes it feel like it's out of our control. So often we don't get to make decisions on what's in our food. So that's why the labeling, I think, is starting to be really interesting. The labeling is helping us to have awareness and get to make decisions with our dollar. So it's I think it's a good thing overall. So when I look at this slide, ScanTrust is a really cool website. One of the requirements that have come into play this year, January, is that companies now that are using any component of a bioengineered product has to have it labeled. And so what they're writing here is, as far as the requirements, one is that it should be directly written on the label. So, letting the consumer know that it's written clearly on the label to be found that this product has some bioengineered ingredients. Has anybody found any food that they buy? I mean, after all this discussion, have you gone to your pantry and said, does this tell me if it has anything bioengineered? Anybody? No? I know, me either. I really could not find it. So, of course, the companies are not jumping at the opportunity to say, just want to let you know there's bioengineered ingredients, right? Where we do find them is with like a lower level, which means that these products, and I'll list them in a second, are being fed to our animals, or they're in manufactured products. And so that's where it becomes really muddy, and these loopholes are making it a little bit easier for companies just to not mention it. But let's keep going. So it can be written directly on the package, bioengineered food. Of course, we can use the symbol, which is the one that I showed you in that first slide. There's another one, and they can provide a digital link. It's a QR code. When did QR codes become popular? During the pandemic, right? Of course, after shutdown and everybody started to sneak out again and maybe visit a restaurant, but we were still kind of worried about germs, and so nobody wanted to touch a menu. And then it became a thing to just have your smartphone and take a picture of this QR code. Anybody do that at a restaurant? Yeah. So it became sort of part of our culture. Okay, I just have to pull up the menu on a QR code. We even did it at Powers Bakery. And funny, when it was brand new, I guess, we jumped on that because it would really help us to get all of our nutrition information and everything right there easy without having to print labels. Well, the health department from San Antonio told us we couldn't do that. And I was like, well, that's unfair. And then like another month, all the restaurants were doing it. So, it takes a while for technology to become accepted, commonplace, user-friendly. And so the digital QR code, of course, is one way that the big food companies are going to give you the information that you might be looking for. Now, is a common person going to grab a Twinkies Ho-Ho and go, I wonder if there's any GMOs in here? No, they're not gonna. So it's really the people that are most conscientious that might ask these questions, but you have to be pretty knowledgeable to know what to ask, where to find the information, and then to pursue the information, and then have to sift through all the scientific data to then find an answer to decide on if you're going to eat that Twinkie. The other one is phone number. So again, I could not find any of these. Here we are in September. January is when it started. I couldn't find any products that would give me any of this to do a little research on for us. So that tells me there's a few loopholes, and companies aren't really having to, or choosing not to for whatever reason, to really do this. Now, of course, we have seen that pretty green label here and there, right? But not very often. So the bioengineered food disclosure standard, the QR code, is one that, so in this slide with a little pineapple on it, I want you to be able to, if you're interested, click on that link and it will show you the whole process, and it will give you some information on how to use this QR code. But again, it takes some work to find it. Takes some work. So now let's think about how other countries handle the regulations on genetic modification. Because we know in the US, we have some sort of our ulterior motives, or maybe we'll just say some complications. And that's because our farm industry is so closely related to our economy. Now that's not to say it's not the case in Europe, but there's a little bit stricter requirements, which I just think is so interesting because it makes us wonder if ours is not safe. You know, sometimes do we think stricter means safer? You know, we want to think that we're safe here in the US even if we don't follow the same rigor. So here's a headline that I found in this little magazine, the Food for Health issue. And of course, we would have to pay for this little download of what the headline is saying is 15 ways the European nations handle food safety like GMOs, hormones, questionable chemicals, and other food additives. And it kind of implies better than the US. But I think I've mentioned in one of my other classes, I've had people from Europe feel like we're not, US is not as careful, and that we have products here that aren't good. Anybody feel like that that's traveled to Europe? No, yes, maybe. I know you were just in Italy, right? Right. Do you remember having maybe foods that seemed healthier or safer? Not necessarily? No, not necessarily. Okay, good. Because sometimes what you don't know is, you know, what you don't know, and it could be like ignorance is bliss. And that happens in restaurants because none of this genetic modification warning will happen in restaurants. It also does not happen with meat and dairy and eggs, because in fact those are managed by a whole different regulatory agency. So it's interesting to see how the Europe countries are handling this a little differently. So here, one of my favorite resources, the Harvard School of Medicine. I'm going to put that one down because I want you to be able to use that. Harvard School of Public Health. This is a great resource, and they gave us this neat little kind of flow chart of how the comparison of the EU and US really looks like when we're looking at food additives. So let's look at that a little bit closer. And basically it's saying the same science, different policies, regulating the GMO in the US and Europe. So they're trying to do the same thing. And I know that's a little bit hard to read, so I'm gonna expand it a little bit for you. And I want you to be able to see in general, the U.S. is going through the research, and then the FDA and the USDA have to approve, and also the EPA. So when we think of the U.S., we have all these regulatory agencies, the FDA, USDA, and the EPA. So FDA is going to look at, all right, institutes of health, so NIH, what do you say about this research? Because these guys don't really do research. They just look through it and decide on the regulations. So the FDA tells us what's safe for people to do based on the research. And they ask all the science experts. And so then the USDA has the regulatory body. So it kind of funnels this way. These guys are a little different. The Environmental Protection Agency isn't quite so concerned about the individuals or the citizens. They are trying to make sure the environment is considered in the whole process. But it's still based on the science, the scientific method. And every time we have a class, I try to always go back to the scientific method. And we talk about, how do we trust research? How do we trust Harvard School of Public Health magazine versus Reader's Digest? Anybody ever look at Reader's Digest? My mom used to buy that one all the time, or I don't know, some of the other newsstand publications. They will oftentimes use anecdotal evidence. They'll use kind of inflammatory terminology or language to kind of slant, because they want you to believe what they're trying to tell you. So that's kind of dangerous, right? It's inflammatory. And I've even shown you some of those guys in these classes. They kind of want to make you trust them only. Remember the naturopath article that I shared with you last time? And there's all kind of erroneous, illogical thinking, because she said, well, come to my website and buy my products and buy my services. And I feel like that's not a good way to teach people how to think through the scientific method. So I feel like the U.S. has done a good job in incorporating lots of experts and several channels of consideration, ultimately for safety. Now let's look at what the EU does. The EU has really one body, and that's where I feel like, maybe that's not as good. Anybody remember what happened with mad cow disease? It was like in the 80s, I think, maybe the early 90s. And a really bad issue broke out because of what was happening with the way the cattle were being fed, and it caused some really bad issues. So this really is in response to that whole idea is well, let's be extra careful, but in the same time, it's looking at several different, instead of using several different entities like we do, it has to go through one category only. And so this EU safety net, the European Food Safety Authority, is the one that makes all the decisions. So you can see that little one line of thought, rather than in the US, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, ultimately making the decision process before it gets to our grocery cart. So the food companies submitted the same types of scientific data, and really it just takes a lot longer for the EU to go through the process. And so it takes more time to come to the same conclusion, because that one entity is doing everything. So I'm not sure which one's better, because like the mad cow issue, they're not perfect either. The whole situation can definitely have problems, whether it's the glyphosate and what happened with Monsanto. On the one side of that discussion, Monsanto did this amazing thing. They were able to create a plant that could withstand Roundup. And remember, I kind of mentioned this last time, that the good thing that came out of that is Roundup now is just used on a very selective basis. They don't have to completely till under all the soil. So it's less labor. It's better for the soil. So the EPA, takes a role in that and says, yeah, that's good. So it's interesting that there's all these different ways to connect. The impact of the US and EU regulations. So again, I know this is small, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but all I want you to really see is that when we look at the impact of US and EU regulations, the takeaway is that the blue line is how much change has happened over the years in Europe allowing products in versus the US. So the US is going, yeah, we don't see any problems with genetically modified or engineered foods. Let's get them into the food chain. EU says, no, let's wait. So reflecting on the fact that US regulations for GM foods are less stringent than those of the EU, more crops are introduced in the US. And we're doing pretty good. I mean, have we had any justifiable cause to take them out? No. And so again, that little YouTube video I was telling you about that really discusses the science education. These guys do really good research and come up with, so far we can't find any reason for it to be dangerous. So I think it's encouraging. This one is another one where it kind of shows the timeline. And, really the takeaway is that we've got several years before a product that has some research done to it actually comes to market. It takes as much as 15 years to have a product now that's either fed to our cattle or fed to our people. So a lot of research goes into it. Okay, so that's it for my slides. So now what I want to do is talk a little bit about that whole nutrition label, because this is actually an interesting thought. When it boils down, Europe does not have the US food label. So the nutrition facts label and really helping the consumer be aware of what the food has. And I've learned so much about this too, just opening Powerhouse Bakery. But as a dietitian and the work I did for HEB, so much of my world is around that nutrition facts panel. So there's 8 things on that panel that help us. And I just kind of want us to step back and know that the GMO and the bioengineer is just one little piece of that label. So let's kind of brainstorm and see if we can remember all the things that are on the nutrition facts panel. And, a lot of times I drift away from this kind of data when I'm counseling somebody, because say their goal is weight loss and we're trying to track calories and grams. You probably have heard my story around this, is that the science around calories and grams is only a little piece of the story when it comes to your overall health. Same thing with genetic engineering. It's just a little piece to the success of your overall health. So I really want us to kind of see that as a summary of this whole conversation and look back on what are all the pieces of the puzzle. So in the nutrition facts, first thing we want to know is serving size. And if we had a bag of chips and we grabbed that bag of chips, not that anybody in here would eat chips, let's just make sure that's clear. Right, Rachel? If we had a bag of chips and we opened them up and started eating, and then we thought, oh, I wonder if this bag has just one serving. Anybody ever do that? And then you look at it and you go, oh, dang, this actually has 3 servings and I've just finished 3 servings. So it's kind of shady when we put more than 1 serving into a bag when we buy it thinking it's 1 serving. And we have this sense of freedom, because if we don't look at this too closely and we see calories and we see, oh, it only has 100 calories, but we didn't look at this and it really has 4 servings in it, but we didn't notice that. Now what do? Oh, crumb. We actually ate 400 calories instead of 100. That happens a lot with chocolate milk. And I know I told you the story of my chocolate milk joy. And I looked at the bottle and it really did say 1 serving, which surprised the heck out of me because it was not all that small. But it gave me like 300 calories, which is not all that low either. So looking at the serving size is important. The calories are important. What are some of the other things we find on the nutrition facts panel? Sugars.
Carbs.
Carbs.
Fat.
Yes. What else?
Protein.
Sodium. Yes. Sodium, protein, and there's one more. That's kind of like the big hitters. Fiber. Yes. And fiber. So those are the big 8. So when even now they teach nutrition in schools, I think they do it in 3rd grade. Correct me if I'm wrong, if any of you have little kids. I think they teach like a brush stroke of nutrition in 3rd grade, and they teach what to look for. And so that's a start, but I'd love to rearrange how they do that. But nonetheless, if we read these numbers, how do we put them in context? If you read a little farther into the nutrition panel, we know that these numbers are based on the food, of course, and based on the serving, but we also have, here's that group again, USDA and the National Institute of Health, decide on how this information is going to be sort of coded, based on what is what we're trying to say. So based on a 2,000 calorie diet, then we're going to get some percentages over here. So if the sugars in this food are 5 grams of sugar, how do we know if that's a lot or a little? Anybody? It's hard to know, right? Based on what? And so what we end up doing is making our own assumptions. Oh, 5 grams, that must be too much. And so then if we take it a little further, we might look up, on the internet, how much sugar should we have in a day? Anybody ever do that? What is it? How many grams of sugar should we have in a day? By the experts. Maybe 20. So 5 grams of 20. Now it's not that much, right? And so we're going to do that all the way down. I even had this lady that was so worried about sodium, and I kind of wanted to give her the whole riot act of sodium really doesn't have that big of a role to play in cardiovascular disease and heart disease and hypertension, but I didn't even want to go there. But she was so worried about having 1,000 milligrams in a day. Anybody know what a low sodium diet should be? It's hard to say, right? Based on what? Well, the USDA says that if you're going to follow a low sodium diet, very low sodium diet, it would have to be 2,000 milligrams a day. So now we got some context. So that's a very low sodium diet. And what would be an average American? Well, that's a crazy number. It's about 7,000 milligrams a day. If you had a sandwich at Starbucks, it has about 2,500 milligrams of sodium in that one sandwich. A lot, right? Compared to what we would say is a very low sodium diet. Now, the good news is most of us don't have to follow that. The good news is most of us have healthy kidneys and we can eat sodium, and yeah, it might not be great for you, but it's not going to cause elevated blood pressure and arteriosclerosis, especially if you only do it once in a while. Now, I'm not suggesting you go out and eat that much sodium, but the label gives us some scare tactics. Because if it says based on a 2,000 calorie diet, make that a little bit clearer, and we don't even know based on what for sodium, because this is really just talking about calories. How do we know anything about the sodium level? And so 1,000 milligrams, we have no context to decide if that's too much or too little. And so that's where, we need to learn more. Let's talk a little bit about the carbs and fats and proteins, because these are the big hitters. These are the macros that really play into our daily nutrition. Anybody ever figure out with MyFitnessPal how many grams, I know you have, Irene, how many grams of carbohydrates you should have in a day? Yeah? So I'm going to erase this just for a minute because I want to play with these items, the proteins, the fats, and the carbs, just for a quick minute, because I want you to see how we decide if it's too much or too little. So we first would have to decide how many calories do we need. And of course, this is what MyFitnessPal does for you. It gives you an algorithm, and it's very fancy because you're feeling like it's personalized, right? If you type in your height, your weight, your age, your activity level, and then it's going to say, okay, do you want to lose weight or gain, and how active are you? So it feels like it's really personalized, right? And then you come up with, okay, I need a 1,500 calorie diet because of all the information I've typed in there. Then it's going to have to do another assumption. It's going to have to assume, well, do you want to follow a low carb diet, a high carb diet, a keto diet, paleo? And it was like, I don't know, just tell me what I need to eat, right? So let's just say what the USDA tells us. And of course, it's decided, those regulations are decided because what the FDA has learned by the World Health Organization and the NIH. So what I'm trying to show you is that all of these entities that really, they impress upon the American or the consumer here a lot more than in Europe. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry of giving you nutrition information and labeling information on your food. It's crazy. I mean, this stuff didn't even exist, 3 generations ago. You just grabbed a Coke and a burger, right? Probably in the 40s. Didn't think about it, but your Coca-Cola jar or bottle was probably about this big, and your burger was, like the Junior Whopper. It was tiny. And so it's amazing when you look back on history and understand where we've come from. And now we've gone into mega super servings, and the USDA and the World Health and NIH and everybody trying to decide, wait a minute, we lost health somewhere from the burger and the soda to, the supersize it. And now we're having to backtrack and figure out how much and why and what's the breakdown. So I love that, we can look back on history and think about, did we really go in the right path by doing all the mega serving sizes? So let's look at this. If we were at 1,500 calorie and we're going to follow what the USDA says, and they say, well, probably about 50% of your calories should come from carbohydrates and about 30% from protein, that would be kind of on the high side, and 20% from fat. And oftentimes these are switched around. The paleo world started making this one go up. And so it's almost normal to say 30 and 20. But if we were to look back, on the original, healthy diet, they would say, really your fats could be 30 and your protein could be 20. Right? So that's really what the USDA says. But a lot of people go, oh goodness, I need my protein. And if you've heard me much at all, I've really changed my thinking, and I probably do believe in the 20% protein. So anyway, 1,500 calories says MyFitnessPal, because you want to lose weight. So your whole goal is weight loss. And you're like, okay, I'm going to follow 1,500 calorie. Has anybody followed MyFitnessPal before? No? A couple of you have? And so when I did this for my clients, when I worked for Lifetime Fitness and of course for HEB, sometimes the algorithm or the formulas miss it so badly that this level is actually higher than what the person was already eating. It could happen. I bet if I did a really detailed 24-hour food survey on each of you, you wouldn't all come up to this many calories. Now, a lot of things could be for that. You might be because you're really bad at reporting. You only want to tell me the good things that you ate, right? But it also could be that people just don't eat consistently a certain amount. There'll be days when you forget to eat breakfast, you hardly ate any lunch, you're too tired to cook dinner, and maybe you did eat 700 calories for dinner and you went straight to bed. And that day you only ate 800 calories. And then you can't go to the next day and go, wow, MyFitnessPal told me that I was negative. I didn't eat, 500 of my calories, so I better increase my intake today. And people will do that. They'll say, well, it says I need 1,500, so I better just eat some more. I think I'll go have a brownie. And so my point in all this story is that the food label can only give us a tiny little piece of the information that's important to us. And sometimes we dig so deep and we take this so literally that we lose the whole beauty of the forest because we're focused on the trunk of one tree. And so what I hope we can do is start to really think about some bigger picture items. So if we're looking at a label, say we're looking at some rice. Is a bag of rice going to have nutrition facts on it? It might. Nutrition facts might be there. Sometimes it doesn't because it's not a processed food. It's an unprocessed food, which means now it's not even regulated, and the USDA doesn't say you have to tell the person how many calories are on it. So be on the lookout for that. I'm curious if you find any, organic Lundberg's brown rice. Does it have nutrition facts? It may or may not. If it's in a box and it's been parboiled, it probably will. And again, when the bioengineered labels come into play, if it's a processed food, so it's parboiled rice, or it's a frozen product of pre-made rice that you have to microwave, it has to have the bioengineered label. If it's organic rice that comes in a clear bag, it doesn't have to have any label. It can say organic on there because that's going to be a win for you, because you're going to, as a health enthusiast, you might be more likely to buy it. If you're driven by cost, you'll be less likely to buy it if it has that front of pack labeling. So the front of pack is really important. This labeling information is going to help you decide to buy or not that product. So it's kind of cool when I think about, even Powerhouse Bakery. I wanted to put on my products, gluten-free, no refined sugar, low sodium, all these things. Sometimes it gets confusing though, right, to the customer, because you think, well, low sodium compared to what? Low sugar compared to what? Is 5 grams too much? Right? And so it definitely gets a little bit muddy. The other thing that I love, and you won't be surprised on this one, is ingredients. So when we think of a bag of rice, how many ingredients do you think are in there? Yeah, just one. Makes it pretty simple. And that's why it changes the whole lineup of the information that's put on the label. What if it was instead of rice, maybe it was rice-a-roni? Anybody ever buy rice-a-roni? No? Yes? When I was a kid, my mom bought that. And so I thought it was pretty yummy. It was salted. It had all the flavors. It smelled really good when you were cooking it. And my mom didn't even have to open up her spice rack. So if it's already made, now all of this stuff changes. The ingredients are required, and it has to have a GMO label. Instead of GMO, we're going to call it bioengineered. See, I'm already trying to use my new terminology. Bioengineered. And this would only be the case if there is somewhere like less than or equal to 5% of some kind of DNA traces in that food. Okay, so let's break that down. If the rice-a-roni has organic rice, but the wheat in the roni part, which is the noodle, if it has no traces of any of the genetic modification DNA, it doesn't have to be labeled. I mean, who's going to follow all this? Right? It's very detailed. And so things like canola oil, it doesn't have any DNA in there. It's just the oil. It's been extracted. The grain might have some DNA, because a whole grain is going to have the whole thing. Remember when I showed you in the beginning that slide that would use different methods for getting the DNA pounded into the rice grain? And so it has some new DNA parts in there. That's what they're worried about with this whole idea of, should we let the consumer know that there's some weird DNA strands in this food? So here's a difference too. If we bought that rice-a-roni in Europe, instead of 5% acceptable amount of DNA traces, it's 0.2% in the European Union, EU. So that's where now we kind of get a bad reputation. It's like, wow, we allow 5%, and Europe only allows 0.2. They must be a lot better off. And so the concept gets lost because we're talking about this esoteric idea of trace amounts of DNA in the bioengineered food. Okay, so now let's go back to our nutrition facts label. I just wanted you to see how that plays out because, you know, a single food versus a processed food. And when we're trying to really eat healthy, what kinds of foods are we trying to eat more of? So, minimally, let's do this. Low processing and low, we'll call it junk or snack foods. Now, be careful because right now we are still in an era that snack foods can be very stylish. They can be very much living in the world of healthy. So you could buy a keto product that has canola oil added that would still be made by a genetically modified plant, and it still could fall under the 5% safety factor. So just be careful because snack foods will definitely have some genetic modification foods potentially added. And if we buy rice in a bag, there's a good chance there's only one thing we have to look for on the label, and that would probably be organic. And then we could feel relatively safe. Irene. That's a great question. So you're talking about produce that has been processed, right? And so did you by chance look at the label? Do we know if there's anything added?
No, I did. My husband bought it, just for curiosity, and it was cauliflower, it was rice, and it actually had mushrooms in it also.
Ah, so 2 ingredients.
Right, it was pretty good, but then I was kind of worried because, you have to put it in the microwave.
Yes, I love your thinking. That is so good. So she was concerned that it had mushrooms added and they had to microwave it. So now the packaging is now of concern because is the packaging going to get some of those dangerous plastics leaching into the food? Those are all definitely concerns that, people are bringing up. Now let's flip that around. Say we wanted to have, what was it? Your cauli rice and mushrooms. How could we do that? That would still be, okay, so how long did it have to microwave? Do you remember?
Less than 5 minutes, I think.
Okay, so we'll say 5 minutes. All right, I probably can't top 5 minutes. I was going to say maybe we could make that from scratch. So yeah, we can't do it in 5 minutes. And I guess what I would say to that is, surely we can have, more time devoted to our food production. But the world that we live in says if it's fast, it's good. Right? And everything's been sped up so much that the slow food movement in Europe is not something that is really revered here. Now that is changing. I think more and more families are looking into making things more from scratch, but not all. And of course the restaurants blow it all out of the water.
Well, what if instead of microwaving it, you just steam it on the stove?
Yeah.
I think about that all the time. If you're doing a steamer instead of microwave.
Yes.
To be safe.
So steam versus microwave. I love that. And, I'm so glad you brought that up, Cecilia, because this goes back to our best foods list criteria, right? If we're always trying to go from good to great and we have a product that we love and it's going to save us some time, how could we go from good to great? And I think that's brilliant. Try cooking it in a little healthier way. So smart. I have had a lot of people ask about frozen fruits and is that too processed A lot of the gals and guys that are going through treatment, cancer treatment, I really encourage them not to do anything raw, cook everything, because that keeps the potential of bacteria much lower. And so I had a call this morning from one of my patients asking if he needed to wash the frozen fruit. What would you tell him? What do you think?
Normally not. I wouldn't have it.
Yeah, I don't think so. And so that's what I told him too. I said, the expectation is that when frozen cherries are in a bag, they are brought from the field, they are washed. Now, it's probably a mechanically driven process. It's probably mechanical, but they are washed and immediately put into the bag. So the chances of manually contaminating that product is much less. Now, I say that, but you probably could all give me an example where there's been salmonella exposure to spinach. So there are going to be things that happen, but at least with frozen fruit, there's much less touching by people that are not in a manufacturing environment. So, it probably is a better choice. But I love that, you're thinking that way and really trying to understand how can we make the best of our decisions when we're still in the throes of learning. How do we save time and still have good quality food? How do we learn to love veggies and not have to cook everything from scratch? And I think that's always where we are. And when we think of, the other parts of that nutrition label, I just want to cover these before we go on, is when we think of the, let's see, we'll do it like this. The fiber and the protein, we didn't really talk about that one as much, but it kind of follows with the same idea of the carbohydrates. These are going to be the big hitters of that label. 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, the sodium and the sugars I talked about briefly, but I really want to make sure that these hit home. And the amounts of what we need are vague. And whenever you find a nutrition facts panel, it's usually on a prepackaged food. So for us to know how much we need of each of these items, it's less important to follow grams, and it's more important to follow variety and satiety. So I always say, get a wide variety of foods, and that reduces our risk of exposure. So even if there is some GMOs hiding in there, we're not going to eat the same food every day. And we always stop before we're full. And so instead of guiding our choices on a nutrition facts panel, we guide our choices by a well-rounded variety, and we don't eat more than we need to feel comfortable. Fiber, to get into the details, if you ate a wide variety of foods and it was at least some plants, we want to shoot for something like 20 to even 40 grams a day. Protein, we've talked a lot about this one, and it could be anywhere from, a low end to a high end of protein per day. And so my reason for sharing this is there's a big variety, there's a big range of what would be acceptable. So to try to put that into context, instead, I recommend that we go with eating a wide variety of foods, minimally processed, and that way we don't get lost in the weeds. Getting lost in the weeds of counting grams, counting all the micronutrients. If we think of the percentages, remember I said if we did a 1,500 calorie diet and we tried to get percentages of each of these, it becomes a math issue rather than a food issue. And like I said, when I was helping so many people with their nutrition, you start to lose the value of the forest because you're so focused on the small details. And so I think the beauty of what Europe has done is they are trying to pull back a little bit and help people focus on the foods, and they are being conservative and trying to make sure that they take some of the decision process away. The good thing about US is that we are in fact distributing the decision process over many entities, and so it does give us room for discussion. But on the other side of the coin, it definitely makes it more complicated, and it requires an educated consumer to be able to sift through all the information. So I hope this has helped. You know, the goal is that we are able to really enjoy our foods and learn from different cultures to find new ways of preparation and seasoning so that we really can enjoy a variety and not feel like we're really trapped in a certain ratio or certain serving size or calorie level. And by the same token, I don't want us to feel like we're really in fear of what's happening with the science and technology of our food husbandry. We've had modifications in DNA since farming started. I do think it's important though for us to be a good watchdog and learn some of these different entities that make some of the decisions for us so that we can at least know what's happening and be involved in areas that we're really passionate about. So. Okay. Well, thank you so much for listening, and look forward to our next visit, and we will be doing some cooking next time for sure. All right. Thanks, everybody.